I'm Keaton Fletcher, an assistant professor of industrial organizational psychology at Colorado State University.
And I'm Mariana Arvon, an organizational psychologist who specializes in organization and talent development.
And this is Healthy Work. All right, and welcome back to another episode of Healthy Work. I am so excited today to be joined by two amazing guests who co-led a really cool effort at our flagship journal. I will get out of the way and let you introduce yourselves.
Thanks, Keaton, for having us. My name is Ian Katz. I'm an assistant professor at DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. My research mainly focuses on proactivity at work, particularly around pro-environmental behavior and how employees are trying to contribute to their organization's goals of becoming more green and helping the environment.
I'm Shelly Rauvola. I'm an assistant professor at DePaul University in Chicago as well. And my research interests center on really the marginalized, under-resourced, and underrepresented worker experiences in organizations. So a lot of my work focuses on occupational health and motivation for folks' stories that haven't been traditionally told or heard.
Amazing. Both of your guys' streams of research, I think, are so important and so cool and really dovetail nicely with the special issue that you led at IOP. And there's so much I want to talk about this special issue and the things that you found. But first, for our listeners, do you want to take a stab at just like describing the special issue and maybe some of the key takeaways from the different articles that had been submitted?
In talking with Shelly, I think it's important to take a step back and just kind of acknowledge the headspace that we've been in over the past year and really beyond that too, with the shifting kind of nature of the climate generally in our country, particularly around science and repressing science and not appreciating science. And I don't think it's an overreach to say that, frankly, we're just upset about the way things have been going. And so we wanted to find a way to kind of channel that affective reaction into something that could be productive. And so the Trump administration has been aggressive with their executive orders, right? So overreaching the traditional means of developing laws or passing bills. And we wanted to take a look at how executive orders and that overreach are affecting the world of work. So as IO psychologists, we're really interested in anything from organizational functioning all the way down to the individual level and how that impacts employees. And so we opened up a call at IOP asking researchers to pick an executive order and just talk about how that would affect the working world. And we were pretty broad about that on purpose, and we got some really excellent submissions.
Yeah, and so we had submissions ranging from topics on the work environment itself, the way that human resources functions are conducted, how people with marginalized identities are adversely affected, and also how training and education for future IO psychologists can stand to be affected by these policies. And we were really excited with all the submissions that we received.
I think it's so interesting because typically in our field, it's not often that our researchers are grappling with policy change at like the government level. Every once in a while you see a paper that spans those boundaries, but I like to think of like work as, it's a contract, right? It is a legal setup. And of course, it's impacted by the legal environment around it. And I thought it was so important that y'all set up this call, and also really glad to see the variety of responses to this call. And as you mentioned, Shelly, like the different topics that really ranged. It wasn't just about some of the, I think, more obvious changes that like directly impact work, but really thinking more widespread about how the broader legal landscape might impact, workers' health and well-being, as well as like organizational functioning, as well as, as you mentioned, the field of biopsychology and how we train our students. And so I would just love if you could dive in a little bit more and give me some more detail on what all is included and what all people talked about.
People talked a lot about things related either tangentially or directly to worker well-being. We've got policies related to gender identity, and we've got policies related to child labor rollbacks, and we've got all sorts of coverage of issues around AI, so artificial intelligence, and also restrictions and changes to what kind of research is even being funded. So what populations can we even be studying their experiences?
What does the world of work look like for workers now compared to 2 years ago, sort of based on the input that you guys got here. Is- How are we doing, guys?
I think not well, honestly. I mean, it's interesting reading the submissions, the commentaries that were submitted. And like Shelley said, they span just about as many areas as our general IO literature spans, right? So, like every area that our individual researchers are caring about, things like the work setting or work processes or worker perceptions and identity, all the way down to how we train IO psychologists. And so, all three of us are academics. We are extremely invested in how we're training the next generation of IO psychologists. And some of these submissions really focused on how the nature of our education, the provision of our expertise is changing too. So there's changes to how students are supported, who and when you can collaborate, challenging misinformation. Like these are all really prevalent issues that are going to permeate from the classroom into our graduates' first jobs and second jobs and so on and so forth, which is really concerning to me and to Shelley too. And it was reassuring from a community perspective to see that reflected in the submissions, but also kind of has a level of just existential dread on top of it.
Yeah, I think in answer to your question, Keaton, we're doing very badly, and we're tracking in a worse and worse direction. I mean, broadly, what a lot of these distinctive topics can boil down to is we're being pushed away from evidence-based practice, and we're being pushed away from doing research to generate better practice, right? Like, let's not actually talk about or center on diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace. And also, let's not do any more research on it either. And that has so many ripple effects for workers, for IO psychologists. And these are the sorts of changes that are not only having negative impacts right now, but stand to continue to have impacts for many years to come.
And I'll add on to that too. I think if we wanted to think maybe methodologically about the things we're observing here, we might say something like the current executive order or climate changes in the US might be affecting the things that already have existed. So, for example, Keaton, your submission, two submissions actually, which we value greatly, one about abortion access for employees and one about exploiting minors at work. Those are issues that have been around for much longer than the last year or 10 years or 15 years. But now those relationships and those shortcomings of our workplaces, those are being exemplified and those are becoming more extreme, and there's less regulation and there's less care being put into those kinds of things. So it's really just highlighting problems that have existed for a long time. And I think the solution to those problems seems farther off than it ever has.
I guess that actually transitions me nicely into another question I have is what do we do? I mean, both, as researchers, but also your average worker. What do we do with the information, the perspectives, the ideas that were in this special issue?
Gosh, I mean, one thing that we, I think one thing we definitely need to do is continue to push for what's right and what's best for workers. And while I grapple a lot with this idea of like, is science political or not, right? It is. And I think it's increasingly kind of in this political sphere, and it has been and will continue to be politicized. That doesn't mean that the things that we have found and observed are best for workers and well-being across levels are political issues, right? Those are just things that we should be doing. And so I think that in organizations, in communities, we need to continue advocating for what's best and what's right, and try to separate these issues from a political affiliation so much, because they're being politicized in a way that's now harming people.
I think that's really well said. And I'll just add something that sort of reflects my own approach to our science and our field, which is I'm very critical of the research that goes on in our field when we are obsessing about finding new ways to understand the working world. And what I mean by that is I think that the theories and the constructs and the operational definitions that we already have need to be thrown into this new setting as opposed to coming up with a whole new paradigm for understanding the world of work. Like I think that the things that we care about as IO psychologists matter now more than ever, right? Things matter like psychological safety, things like autonomy, things like job characteristics, right? Like feeling like your work supports you in a humane way. Those things matter now more than ever. And the barriers to implementing those things might become a lot more difficult. And the effort that we need to put into them needs to increase commensurate with those boundaries. But I think we need to throw the book at these problems in a way that we've already been tackling them for a very, very long time. And I'm encouraged and excited by the responses we got to this special issue that are doing just that. You know, we're good at what we do. And I think we need to just apply that to the evolving setting that we have.
I think to both of your points that when we're doing good science and the science happens to be around topics that are politicized, like we can still throw our science at this and we still ought to communicate the best practices and what we know around these outcomes and how to solve these problems in ways that we have nearly 100 years of evidence for, right? Over 100 years in some instances. And I think this special issue does just that. And I like that it also shines a light on some relatively understudied topics. But to your point, Ian, that they're not so novel that we don't know what to do with them. We have plenty of theories. We have plenty of methods and interventions that likely can be used to direct attention towards them and start to solve these problems in ways that we would expect based on sort of what we've seen in other aspects of our field. And so I love this special issue. I love you guys' perspective on this. I'm curious, while editing this, because obviously that has to have been just a massive amount of work to read all these different perspectives, to figure out what you want to say with the special issue as a whole and how to integrate the disparate different topics. Was there anything that surprised you or really challenged you while you're doing this?
I would say that something that really surprised me and honestly caught me off guard while working on this special issue, both in kind of providing feedback to authors as we were reviewing the submissions to the call and also interacting with prospective authors, was just the amount of fear that there was around writing these policy briefs in the first place. A lot of folks were navigating things with their legal departments, with their department chairs, were actively being kind of dissuaded from submitting to the special issue for fear of some sort of backlash against them or it hurting their tenure chances. And I think, even in reading the individual submissions, there were some times when it felt like people were dancing around the issue more than I perhaps anticipated. And I think that really speaks to how uncertain and scary the times that we are all existing in are, and how even the authorship teams, both represented in this special issue and not, were and continue to be affected by this climate.
Maybe I should have consulted with legal before we sent our submissions. But yeah, even in our discussions, not necessarily for the special issue, but for other papers, because this is, I think, the third paper now that I've published on abortion access. We, as authorship teams, talked about, do we use the word abortion in the title or in the abstract? Do we feel comfortable having a student author as first author if there is a lightning rod moment and this captures a lot of attention because it uses the word abortion? Do we want that fire coming down on a student, or should we have the faculty be the corresponding author or the first author, something along those lines, or shared first authorship? And those considerations around the world outside of academia, the world outside of our research, and having very scary practical implications on the process of even trying. And what really comes to mind, Shelley, is just this chilling effect that we hear about in Supreme Court rulings around the First Amendment, right? That you have a First Amendment right to free speech, and that ought not be infringed, and that includes acts that would chill free speech, that would make people hesitate to use their voice in a public sphere, in a public setting. And I can't think of a more public sphere setting than open access research. And it sounds like you firsthand saw a lot of a chilling effect. And I just, yeah, how dark.
It really is. And I think, this is maybe beyond the scope of the conversation, but Shelly and I both have talked a lot about this. And Keen, I'm sure your experience has been similar, but when we've submitted papers in our own research out of our own labs that cover topics that might be considered political by some, things like, allyship processes and behaviors for me, and Shelley, maybe I'll let you speak to your own work, but we get comments from reviewers that maybe this is too political, that they don't want to be involved in promoting these ideas that can be seen as controversial, things like that, which, I mean, that's just the opposite of what we need to be doing, honestly. I guess I'll transition that into to answering your question, Keaton, which is a challenge that I saw here is that we need to remember what we are and what we aren't. Like, we are behavioral scientists who can provide unique and important insights into the working world, but we're not legal experts, right? So I think we got some submissions that leaned a little bit too hard into legal interpretation of certain executive orders or the way that policy and processes were prior to the executive orders. And that's kind of beyond the scope of what we do. And Shelley and I toyed with bringing on an additional editor for this that was a legal expert, right, to speak to some of that. But we decided against it because we wanted to really just focus on the things that we are good at and the things we know and where we can inflict the most change.
First of all, staying in like APA guidelines of our scope of practice, right? We don't have training in legal expertise, but also I think what's really just beautiful about the special issue is it does sit at that intersection, and it gives us a space to have a seat at that table and not to let those conversations around legal changes only be had by people who are experts in the law or people who are economic experts, but recognizing that there is value and expertise by people like us that have this behavioral scientist expertise that understand the individual experience of work, and that is valuable and important and needs to be represented in those conversations. And I think we do lose that if we try too hard to be something that we're not, that we try to be legal experts, then and we aren't and we don't do well. But like having our voice as behavioral experts in this conversation around the law or broader economic structures or things along those lines, I think is really important. And the only way to do that well is, to your point, Ian, like being true to ourselves and who we are and our expertise and what can we bring uniquely to that table, and not just sort of parroting other people who are more expert in different topics that are already at the table. My last big question for you, and I think this is pretty big. Why do you do this work broadly?
I do this work because it's what brings value to my professional life. I entered into IO psychology because I wanted to make a difference in organizations in more of a system standpoint, while also focusing on studying the experiences of individuals. And yeah, if I'm not doing work that is potentially a little bit controversial, depending on who's defining what is controversy externally. If I'm not doing work that's potentially controversial, that's pushing some edges, peeling back at some cracks, trying to kind of tease apart the historical areas we haven't focused on as much, or the things that we aren't talking about enough, then I wouldn't be fulfilling my goals, and I don't think I would be ultimately happy. So maybe it's a selfish reason. Maybe I'm just like selfishly doing this work, but ultimately I'm trying to help people, and and that's what brings me here.
Yeah, I don't really want to follow that, but I will. I think I agree with what Shelley said, that it sort of was it was a selfish practice to some extent. And I'll say this about the special issue, which is not something that I'll say about any other piece of research that we put out, which is I don't care if this ever gets cited by anyone. I think for me, my main motivation here was to feel a sense of community and connection with other IO psychologists who feel and think similarly to I do. There's never a time in the year that I feel more motivated and connected than after our annual conference at SIOP each year. And I wanted to recreate that at a time where it's hard to feel connected. It's hard to feel community. It's hard to feel safe in the work that we do, not just as IO psychologists, but as civilians in the US, right? It's a tough time. And so having a formal way and maybe a productive way to connect and communicate and hear from other IO psychologists who are out there who are doing the work that I perceive to be really, really important and inspirational. And that just feels good. And sometimes that's what it's all about. It's just doing the work that feels like you are fulfilled and makes a difference.
I love it. It is like a Rolodex of who's in this space. That is like one of the first things I did. I went and looked at all the authors. It's like, oh, okay, all right, these are the people. These are my people. Yeah, I totally understand and appreciate that. And thank you both so much for creating that space for our field to have this outlet. And I absolutely understand what you mean, Ian, of like, I don't care if this gets cited because like it just was good to feel like you had a voice to create something and direct attention towards topics that you are spiraling around for months at a time and have a way to coherently bring your thoughts together and our science and best practices together into a document that even if no one else reads, it created that community with co-authors and it felt like you were part of something bigger, which, you know, is important. And so again, thank you both for creating that space for us and for doing the great work. And I can't wait to one day have you each individually on for the research that you do and not just for coordinating a special issue, because you both do great work. Anyways, thank you both so much for your time and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Keaton.
Thanks, Keaton. Bye.
Healthy Work is a podcast written and executive produced by Keaton Fletcher and Mariana Arvon. This episode is produced, mixed, and edited by Keaton Fletcher. Artwork is by Keaton Fletcher. And our music is Zero, Microsong by Steve Combs. Please like us, follow us, and subscribe on whatever podcatching software you use. And please leave a review on the iTunes Store. It really does help get us out there.